السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الخلق وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. اللهم بارك لنا في جمعنا هذا، اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مباركا مرحوما، واجعل تفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما، ولا تجعل فينا ولا منا ولا معنا شقيا ولا محروما. آمين آمين. Amma ba'd, welcome everyone who's here in the masjid and who's with us through Facebook and YouTube. We have a very important lecture tonight with Sister Serina Ayyad, and she's going to be giving a presentation on substance abuse and addiction. And this subject, again, is so important, as we've mentioned in many of our classes and many of our khutab, and it's so important because it has a deep impact on our community, and its implications are very real on us as individuals and as families and as a community as a whole altogether. The subject of addiction applies to a lot of different things, as we'll learn from Sister Serina. It's not just about substance abuse, even though that's definitely one of the ones that has the deepest impact on our community. You know, the solutions for it are there. We need to learn about the solutions. Our masjid is one of those solutions. Our relationships are also a solution. Our communication with each other and having a support system is another solution. This subject can save lives. Many of our children, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, have found themselves derailed in their personal lives because of the issue of addiction. And it's one of those things that we'll learn. Sometimes you can't break out of it all by yourself. And sometimes people fall victim to addiction. They are good people at heart, but they need help. And that's why the masjid, alhamdulillah, has an initiative to try to support and help anyone who's struggling with any of these addictions. We have a hotline that's there. Sister Rana, our social services department head, has put a lot of efforts into opening the masjid's doors and giving access to the type of help that's needed for people with drug addictions and with other types of issues and struggles that they're dealing with. So please listen carefully to what our sister is going to present, and please share it. Share it with your children, with any brother or sister you know that is struggling with addictions. We really need to work together as a community to address this issue head on. And I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal puts a lot of benefit in the words of Sister Serina. So please listen attentively, and if there are sisters in the back who would like to come in the front on this side here, you're welcome. And brothers, you're welcome to come forward if you'd like as well, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair, and please listen to Sister Serina.
Hello. All right. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So I had a wonderful introduction from Sheikh Osama. Jazakallah khair. I also wanted to further introduce myself a little bit. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor. I have just about under 10 years of experience working in hospital settings with substance abuse. I also have a private practice in Montclair where I specialize with working people in recovery, as well as adult children of alcoholics and couples and families dealing with addiction. So inshallah, let's get started. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is everything that is going to be stated today is going to be based off of research, which I think is the best way to go about this presentation. So inshallah, if there's any further questions that anybody has, I recommend that you go to nida.ih.gov, which is a national institute that pumps out a lot of research on addiction. You can be occupied for hours and hours reading the research on there, inshallah. So the first thing that I wanted to mention is actually ask a question to everybody, whether you're sitting here today or you're at home streaming, is what can you do for your community, right? What can you do for your community? Because some people donate money, some people donate time, some people donate resources. And the best way to look at this is by saying, what are some of my strengths and how can I apply this to a place that's always giving back to us, mashallah. And I look at the community like an extended family. We're all connected to each other. And it's a system, right? And what is the definition of a system? A system is a bunch of different parts that work together to achieve a common goal, right? And we all don't have to be the same or give the same thing in any of this. And when I think of a system, I think about our bodies, right? So we have skin, we have hair, we have bones, right? We have organs, bodily fluids. And if one part of our body is affected, let's say if it's our intestines, the rest of the body doesn't shut it out, right? Your heart doesn't say, I'm too busy beating 85 beats per minute, I don't have time for you intestines, right? Your whole body bands together to help this one part. And inshallah, that's what our community will look like if we all provide a little bit of something, right? We're all working together to achieve this common goal. Because there's a lot of people with substance abuse that are suffering in silence, right? And the most important thing about this is that we have numbers and we're stronger together. So it's about saying, how can we band together to help the people that are suffering, right? How can we encourage them to come to the masajid and seek help? How can we encourage them to nurture their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How can we just be supportive for those of the family members, right, that are dealing with people in their family that are suffering from addiction? So the statistic actually is 1 in 3 families has one person dealing with substance abuse. And addiction is a family disease. So let's say you have a family of 5, right? So that means 5 people are suffering silence from this issue. So it's saying, what could we do to relieve that burden? And if we help one person in our community who is suffering in silence, we have done an incredible thing. So inshallah, if there's one thing you take away from this lecture today, I can't say it enough or emphasize it enough. It's what way can you give back to your community? So I wanted to kind of start off with my first slide that says, how does judgment and blame affect our community, right? We can all imagine how judgment and blame affects our community. There's nothing really positive that comes out of judgment and blame. And where does judgment come from? Judgment comes from the lack of understanding, right? If we don't have enough education or we don't have enough understanding on something, it's very easy for us to judge people, right? It's very easy for us to blame parents if their kids come out addicted to a substance, right? It's easy to kind of point that finger, but it doesn't serve any purpose, right? It doesn't serve kind of what we were talking about earlier, strengthening our community and helping our community to be the best that they could be. So judgment and blame also comes from thinking that substance abuse is a lack of willpower or a lack of discipline, right? So over the past 20 years, we've classified addiction to be a disease, and it's being treated in hospital settings. So something else when it comes to addiction is the belief also comes from that we're immune to substance abuse based on how much money we make, how educated we are, our status, our culture, our religion. And I think a lot of times when we do have these preconceived notions, right, if I feel that, hey, I'm immune to addiction, it's a very tricky place to be. And I can speak for myself, right? If I'm a Muslimah, here I am as a Muslimah. And not only that, but here I am as a substance abuse counselor. It would be almost silly for me to think that my child would be immune from substance abuse and that I would never have to have these conversations with my child. Of course, we encourage to have these conversations and talk about the harms and the issues of addiction. So I just wanted to quickly give a personal experience of something that happened early on when I was working at a hospital. I was with a family, a non-Muslim family, and I was educating them on addiction because their daughter was suffering from addiction at the time. And the family was upset. They were in complete shock. They could not believe that this happened to them. They said nobody in their family had issues with substances. and how did it get to this point with their child. So, you know, as anybody would, I kind of educated them on addiction. And then as the mom was walking out of the house, out of my office, not my house, she said something to me that really shook my core. She said, "This is not supposed to happen to us. We have a membership to a country club." And I kind of sat there and said, what does having a country club have to do anything with being sober? But in her mind, there was a connection, right, to that status. That, hey, if we are able to afford a country club and we do these high-end things, my child should not be suffering from substance abuse. She then proceeded to pull her child out of treatment and bring her to the country club every single day. If I only knew the name of the country club that cured everybody from addiction, I would give it to everybody. But there's also a saying in Alcoholics Anonymous, which I think is a very important saying. It says, Park Ave, Park Bench. And what does that mean? You could be a millionaire living on Park Ave in New York City, or you could be homeless sleeping on a park bench. Addiction can still affect you. And that's why it's important to have these types of conversations, not only in our community, but with our children, right? And talk about how this is clearly harmful and harmful to our bodies. So when talking about this specifically, because bringing it back to the judgment and blame, if we have judgment and blame within our community and I'm suffering from substance abuse, how would it feel for me to come here, right, if I know that people are going to judge me? It's gonna prevent me from asking for help. It's gonna prevent me from picking up the phone. And a lot of times what it does is it perpetuates this feeling of guilt and shame. Right? So if I feel guilt and shame, what am I going to do? I'm more likely to relapse and use. And kind of going back to the issue of status and, you know, money, when I was working in the hospital, a lot of my clients were middle to upper class professionals. And it's almost like it was justified to themselves. What they would do is they thought because they had high-paying jobs, professional careers, successful families, that it was okay, or their substance abuse wasn't as bad, and they would turn a blind eye, right? Because they had this validation of continuously, supporting their families. So kind of going into the next point, is the PowerPoint up or? Oh, okay. So I'll be more in depth. So there's something in therapy, which is the most successful form of way to treat addiction. Is called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's also extremely helpful when it comes to anxiety and depression, but that's a big fancy word to say your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected. And I want you to think about it like a triangle, right? You have thoughts, you have feelings, and you have behaviors. So if I think badly about myself, right, how am I going to feel about myself? I'm not going to feel too good about myself. And how am I going to behave? I'm going to behave in ways that aren't really too desirable. And we believe that if you change one of those things, so if you change your thinking, or if you change your feelings, or if you change your behaviors, any one of them, right, the other two kind of follow suit. So if you partake in behaviors that are desirable, right, you're going to start feeling how about yourself? You're going to start feeling better about yourself, and how are you going to think about yourself? You're going to start thinking better about yourself. And there is an actual phenomenon in psychology, right? What is it called? It's called the do-good, feel-good phenomenon. So the more good you do, the more you give back, the better you feel, right? And it's kind of this positive reinforcing cycle. And those are kind of the cycles that we want to have when it comes to substance abuse. Okay, so I wanted to ask you guys, what do you guys think addiction is? Even though I kind of mentioned a couple things. When we say addiction, what's one of the first things that come to mind? It's definitely disease. Actually, that's completely right. So I'm going to just jump right to the point of saying, because addiction is absolutely a disease. So a lot of times there is some misconception with addiction being a disease, because some people might say, well, addiction's not contagious, right? So how can it be a disease? Or it's completely preventative, so how can it be a disease? It absolutely does fit the criteria and the bill for being a disease. Because if we look at other diseases around, right, we think cancer, we think blood pressure, heart issues, right? These are all things that are not, contagious at all. And when we think about prevention, I always think about diabetes, right? Because diabetes is completely genetic as well as lifestyle. And this is something that's completely preventable, So substance abuse falls in that category. The other thing that makes addiction a disease is because, let's just say hypothetically, I'm an alcoholic, right? And I go to a hospital and they take all the alcohol out of my body. What happens when I leave the hospital? Do I change? Do I act differently? Maybe a little bit, right? But my brain structure has been altered. And it's going to take a while for me to really get back to who I am. So there's something called acute withdrawal. So I want you to think of any time you've ever stopped drinking coffee, anytime you've maybe stopped drinking, stop drinking coffee, let's say stop eating sugar, stop eating carbs, any of those things, stop smoking cigarettes, what ends up happening? You deal with the initial withdrawal symptoms, right? They last about a week. But with addiction, there's something called post-acute withdrawal, right? And what is that? So these are the withdrawals that we experience anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. And that's why people like me kind of work with addiction long-term, right? Because we're reframing these behaviors. We're training the brain how to think positively, think in better ways. So something else that makes addiction a disease, which is super important, is it can be diagnosed, right? You have to meet a couple of symptoms in order to be diagnosed with addiction. You need treatment, it needs to be maintained, and it's chronic, right? So if I don't work on my addiction, it doesn't go away. It's something that's continuously chronic. And going back to Alcoholics Anonymous, they have a lot of good little sayings. And one of the sayings that I really like from them is, once a pickle, never a cucumber, right? So if you have a cucumber and you decide to pickle it, right? Let's say it goes through the process of addiction, and you say, I don't like this pickle. Can you ever bring it back to being a cucumber? No. So it's saying that my brain is altered, right? I have almost turned on like a light switch. I think of like an autoimmune disease, right? You can do so many things to manage a flare-up with an autoimmune disease, but at the end of the day, you can never go to reverse that actual autoimmune disease. So I'm just going to kind of describe it to you. I have a quick picture that just really just talks about the health of your brain. Because I think this is a lot of times one of the best ways to talk to adolescents about addiction, which is you're putting something into your body that we might not be able to see how it's physically affecting us, but a lot of times it's helpful to think about, I'm damaging my brain, right? Especially if you're 15, 16, and you don't think smoking pot is a big deal. It is a huge deal. Your brain doesn't stop developing until you're what age? 22 to 25? Okay, so my next question is, who is affected by addiction? So the short answer is pretty much everybody. So genetics qualifies for, I believe, up to 50% of how susceptible you are to addiction. So this is higher than high blood pressure, high cholesterol, cancer, and I believe diabetes, right? So just because you have a genetic component for addiction, this does not mean that you're 100% going to fall into the pattern of addiction, right? And this is why we were talking about earlier, it's important to kind of have these conversations, right? Because as Muslimin, we don't drink and we don't do drugs, right? So if I have a genetic component, I really don't know, because nobody in my family has ever engaged in these behaviors. And the best thing to do is saying, you know what, I'm going to treat it like I do. Because the markers are there's a number of them in the body. And the way that we think about it is nature and nurture, right? So it's a little bit of genetics and it's a little bit of our environment that really work together to really bring out the addiction. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the slide that I have in front of me. So environment. What are some environmental factors that contribute to addiction? So any type of traumatic event in the home, right? So we have abuse, criminal behavior, mental illness. If there's any neglect, divorce, or substance abuse, obviously this increases our likelihood of abusing substances when we get older. But there's also a bunch of preventative factors, which we're going to get a little bit more into later on. But a community that provides healthy after-school activities is a huge preventative factor, right? This is also the fact if we engage with our certain friends group that are healthy for us. So if we have healthier friends versus unhealthier friends, this makes an incredible difference in, our likelihood of addiction, as well as being mindful of the environment that we put ourselves in. And when I think about all these preventative factors, I think about all the wonderful activities that the masjid actually has here, right? We have various youth committees, we have various activities, we have halaqat, we have lectures, we have all these different activities to keep the family involved, and not only the family involved, the youth here, right? And I can speak for myself, I grew up in this masjid. The friends that I've made in this masjid have been priceless, you know, and I remember I went to public school, and growing up on Fridays, I would actually look forward to coming here and seeing a lot of my friends that I wasn't able to see in public school. Also, a little bit more about my experience in the community is there was a halaqat on Friday nights for women. I was actually teenagers that I would always look forward to. And I remember the woman that ran the halaqat, and she's somebody that was so deeply close to my heart, right? Because when you're a teenager and you're going through these issues, right, you're dealing with public school, you're dealing with school, you're dealing with all these different issues, and to kind of have a steady home base that you know that you can always go back to, right? A place that you know that can nurture your soul and nurture your friendships with beneficial people. You know, what more can you ask for at that period in your life? So I'm going to briefly touch on parenting styles. So parenting styles. So I want you to think about the two complete opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to parenting that contribute to substance abuse. So on one end, I usually think of military families when I think about people in this situation, which is people that have incredibly high expectations on their children and show very low affect or emotion towards these children, right? It's okay to have high expectations on your children, right? You want your kids to do the best that they can do. But what it comes with is nurturing and understanding and motivating that child behind that, right? So we have extremely strict parents with no affection, and then on the other end, we have parents that do not provide any type of routine, any type of structure, any type of discipline to their children, right? A lot of times children crave that structure, they crave that routine, they crave that discipline, and that really does help. So typically kids that are in either end of the spectrum, right? We have overly permissive parents and we have overly intense parents that aren't giving, you know, helpful motivation to their children. They rank lower in happiness, lower in social skills, and lower in self-esteem. So a couple other things that I wanted to mention when it comes to community, because I know I briefly mentioned it before, is a little study. So there's a study called the Rat Park Study. I believe it was originally done in the 70s. And the whole point of this study was to study rats and how they interact in their community. And why was this important? Because in the 70s, when people were going away for Vietnam, they were using, the soldiers over there were using heroin into excess. So people were fearful of when these soldiers came back home that they would be dealing with a lot of people addicted to heroin. So they began to study rats, right? Because the people that came home did not come addicted to heroin. They said, you know, what? This is such an unlikely behavior. So what ended up happening was they put these rats in this cage and they gave one bottle full of pure water and the other bottle was filled with heroin-laced water. So what ended up happening to these rats is they ended up drinking the heroin into excess and they ended up passing away. So they decided if we take these same group of rats, the ones that survived, and we put slides, those little tunnels that you put hamsters in, we put other friends in there, a bunch of different people, how would the rats react in this situation? So surprisingly, what they ended up doing when they created this fun environment, this nurturing community for these rats, the rats never went to the heroin-laced water. So this once again shows that it really does validate the importance of support, of friends, and the community. So let's talk a little bit about how do I know if I have a problem, right? So let's say for whatever reason, I'm hypothetically using recreationally and I'm not sure if I have a problem. This is a main question I always get with a lot of my clients, especially with alcohol. So the short answer to all of this is saying if there's any negative consequences to my use, which means if there's anything bad that happens to me due to my use, this means I probably have a problem, right? So number one thing to really look at is my relationships. Are my relationships strained, right? I think a good example of this is a lot of times people use alcohol to blow off steam after a long stressful day or a long work day, or a lot of times maybe they might smoke pot or whatever it might be. And you come home to your significant other, right, your husband or your wife, are you really going to be engaged in conversation with that person? No, right, because you're going to be under the influence. Are you building connection? Are you having communication? Are you talking adequately? Probably not. You're not really flourishing. And I think a lot of times, too, this affects our parents. This affects how we interact with our siblings. And this really affects how we show up in our friendships with other people, right? Because how often am I really under the influence? And am I really contributing anything productive to that relationship? So probably no. So the next one is the inability to work through your emotions without a substance. So if you have this substance, right, and you need it to get through your day, chances are obviously you have a problem. And I wanted to break that down a little bit more, because what does it mean to deal with our emotions, right? And how does substance abuse affect how we deal with our emotions? It affects how we deal with our emotions because I want you to think about it as you have this credit card, and every time you're upset, you swipe that credit card, right? And you're swiping it over and over and over again. You have no intention of ever paying it off. It ends up collecting interest, and this credit card is your emotions, right? Because we see this all the time. I'll just use teenagers as the example in this situation. Let's say if you're 15 years old and you're smoking marijuana and you get in a fight with your mom, right? What do? You get upset, you go to your room, you smoke some pot. Are you really dealing with those angry emotions? Are you really working through the issues that are contributing to conflict with your parent? No. So what ends up happening, it ends up creating this cycle of use every time we feel any type of emotion, right? So if I get upset, if I get sad, if I get hurt, if I'm fearful, if I'm feeling anxiety, if I'm feeling depressed, we go completely to that substance. So going back to the credit card metaphor, what ends up happening is if I start, let's say hypothetically, smoking when I'm 15 years old and I'm 30 years old, and let's say at 30 I decide I want to get sober, what ends up happening? All those years of swiping that card, I have to deal with all those emotions, because emotions don't go anywhere, especially grief, specifically grief. So I think a lot of times, and it's important for me to mention this because a lot of people are scared, people that use consistently are scared to get sober for this reason, right? They're fearful of what they have to deal with. They have to deal with everything that they've been running from for all these years. There's also something called arrested development, which is very common, which is whatever age you start using is the age you are almost mentally, right? So a lot of times you see people that are under the influence throw a lot of tantrums, they get very angry, they don't know how to work through their intense feelings, and it's because if a lot of us, right, like a lot of us maybe sitting here, have not used the substance when we were developing or when we were growing, we actually learn how to work through those emotions. We actually learn how to grow. We actually learn with our mood, right? So substance abuse is very crippling in that way. So I wanted to actually talk about, I was actually listening to a psychiatrist talk about how he was working in a college campus from 2010, 2011, and 2012. So he said when he was on the college campus, what he noticed was 2010, they had a normal amount of students. 2011, they had another normal amount of students. In 2012, what they actually noticed is there was 3 times more students coming to the counseling center on campus. And not only that, but they were reporting difficulty dealing with everyday things, right? They weren't asking for attention. They just had a lot of difficulty dealing with basic emotions. So what they ended up doing was, which I thought was so interesting, these kids were 18 in 2012. They ended up tracking what year these kids were born. What year were they born? 1995. So what started happening in 1995? The internet came along, right? Became very common. 1998, we see computers accessible in people's household. So this is not bashing technology or anything, but if you think about it, right? So I think back to where I was when I was a kid, and let's say hypothetically I failed the test in the 3rd grade. What did I have to do? I had to sit with those emotions for 8 hours until I got to see my mom. And she would probably get mad at me, right? Which is normal. But I had to sit with that discomfort for 8 hours, like a lot of us do. But what happens nowadays? You just text your mom, hey mom, I failed my test. So there's a difference between being able to feel and work through those emotions, right? Because you learn how to deal with that anxiety. You learn how to deal with those, how do I troubleshoot? I have to deal with this in that moment. Or a very common one too, if you get in a fight with your significant other, say if I was married to my husband 20 years ago and I had got into a fight with him, in the morning before I went to work, I have to mention all the details. So I would have to sit with that for 8 hours, right, before going home and being able to talk to my husband over whatever we got into an argument. Whereas now I could just pick up a phone. And this is emotional regulation, right? This is being able to work through your emotions, being able to work through that uncomfortability. So I think sometimes we need to cut teenagers and people that are born after 1995 some slack, right, because they have some difficulty regulating their emotions. So another thing is the inability to socialize or perform without a substance. We see this a lot with alcohol, right? People having to drink in excess to be able to go to a happy hour, to be able to go to anything, any type of events. And we'll talk about types of substance later on, inshallah, if we have time. But I like to say, when talking with my clients, that America really does, we do have a drinking problem in this country because it's so accepted culturally to drink into excess, right? Every type of event we see, people are drinking into excess. I remember turning on Good Morning America in the middle of the pandemic, and Martha Stewart's teaching people how to make a quarantini at 9 o'clock in the morning. Is this really necessary, right? Is this genuinely necessary? And it's completely normal, right? According to our culture in this country, right? It's completely normal. And that's why people, non-Muslims, really do suffer when getting sober, right? Because their families all drink. Weddings are around drinking, right? So this is really the inability to socialize or perform without a substance. This is also legal issues, financial issues, physical issues, psychological issues. And then obvious, the number one is putting yourself in a risky situation to obtain a substance. So if you're not getting it prescribed by your doctor or you're not buying it legally, you're obviously putting yourself into a risky situation. So I wanted to ask, so why do we think people typically abuse substances? So what are reasons why people typically abuse? Does anybody want to say anything? Does anybody want to participate and say why we think people abuse substances? Okay, definitely. If people are dealing with some depression. So if we see some self-medicating behavior, so self-medicating means I'm not going to a doctor to prescribe me something, right? I know that I'm depressed or I know I'm anxious, so I go onto the internet and I read that marijuana helps with depression. So what am I going to do? I'm going to smoke some pot. Or I know that alcohol might help with depression. I'm not feeling well. So this is self-medicating. This is not going to a doctor or getting something prescribed. This is I'm self-medicating because I'm not feeling too well. Another one is low self-esteem, right? If I'm not feeling too good about myself, I'm going to use substances. A lot of times we do also see, especially with Adderall in the recent years, a lot of people are doing Adderall into excess because there are unrealistic expectations put on work and in school, right? You're expected to take all these exams, you're expected to perform over the top in work settings, so what do people end up doing? They end up abusing Adderall, right? This is also technically self-medicating if you're not, getting it prescribed from a doctor. So something that I quickly wanted to say about this is a little bit about instant gratification versus delayed gratification. So what does that even mean? So instant gratification means when I want something, I want it right now. What's delayed gratification? Delayed gratification is I could wait a little bit before I get this. So they did a study in the 70s. I guess they were doing a lot of studies in the 70s. So it was called the marshmallow study. So what they did with a bunch of kids was they said, I'm either going to give you 1 marshmallow now, or I can give you 2 marshmallows later, right? So that's instant gratification. You either get 1 now, or you wait a little bit and you get 2 later. So they ended up tracking these kids, and what did they end up noticing? The kids that picked 2 marshmallows later end up achieving higher academic success than those working with the 1 marshmallow. And we see this with substance abuse a lot, right? Going back to the issue of dealing with our emotions, which is if I'm feeling uncomfortable in my body, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, what do I want? I want something to help me rid of my emotions right now. Whether it's going on my phone, whether it's any other type of behavioral addiction, right? Or a substance which works very easily. But my favorite thing to tell people is the best way to work on instant gratification is completely free. Do we know what it is? Hassan, do you want to take a guess what you think works on instant gratification? Working out, yes. You guys are so on top of this today. So absolutely, working out and exercise is one of the best things that you can do in recovery or for yourself in general. Why is exercise so important? So number one, what it helps you do is, because if I start working out today, right, and I start dieting today, am I going to see results today? No. Am I going to see results next week? Probably not, and probably not the following week. Probably after a month of really putting in effort at the gym, what do I start seeing? Start seeing results, and this is the exact definition of delayed gratification, because we still eat healthy and we still go to the gym, and what do we tell ourselves? I know I might see the results today, but I know, inshallah, in a month from now, I'm going to see these results. So number one, it's rewiring your brain for delayed gratification. Number two, what else? You're working on your self-esteem, right? You start feeling better about yourself. You're working out. You're doing things that are good for your body. The other thing is you're dealing with your stress. You're dealing with your depression. You're dealing with your anxiety. A lot of times you're working up that frustration. You're really balancing the dopamine in your brain. And lastly, which I think is huge, excuse me, if you're dealing with addiction, especially with substance abuse, right? Working out is really such a big key, because when you start getting sober, especially in early recovery, what are you dealing with? You're dealing with a lot of urges and cravings, right? You really want to use, you really want to relapse, but you know you can't because you want to stay on the cusp of sobriety. So what is a beneficial way to do it? So a craving usually only lasts 15 minutes. So we always recommend to exercise. Go out for a walk, remove your environment, do something to break that thought for 15 minutes, and exercise is the perfect thing. My clients always told me that working out and walking on the treadmill just for 15 minutes helps such a difference. So something else that, why people usually abuse substances is attachment issues, right? So if they have difficulty with attaching with other people, so let's make sure I'm on track. Okay, so what do we think is at the heart of addiction? So other than the disease, other than the genetic component, other than our environment, other than our friends, what's at the heart of substance abuse? It's isolation and shame, right? Because the two can't work with each other until they go hand in hand. So a lot of times there's a difference between guilt and there's a difference between shame, right? So guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is I am wrong, right? I am completely a bad person. So once again, doing something bad and I am bad. And how do we feel if we're dealing with extreme feelings of shame? Am I going to want to go out? Am I going to want to put it on display? Probably not. I'm going to want to isolate. And then I beat myself up about how horrible I am and everything that I do wrong, which is absolutely true, because people that suffer from addiction nobody beats themselves up harder than people that suffer from addiction and substance abuse. So this is why community-based settings, or like when I worked in programs, group therapy helps. Because when you sit in a circle with other people and they tell you that you're not alone, right? And they tell you that you don't have to deal with this by yourself. And you know what? I understand you're suffering, but there's time to heal, right? You can turn over the leaf. You can do better. Just because your life started this way, just because you fell into addiction, doesn't mean that it has to be this way for the rest of your life. And it motivates you. And you start internalizing, right? And it goes back to that cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Feeling better about yourself, thinking better about yourself, and behaving in ways that are better. So we're going to talk a little bit about risk prevention and protective factors. So risk factors, if we see kids that are usually aggressive in their childhoods, lack of parenting supervision, which we mentioned before, we have low peer refusal skills, which means you give in very easy to peer pressure, curiosity with drug experimentation, Availability with drugs at school and community poverty are usually risk factors for substance abuse. So going back over again, some protective factors are the ability to meet your goals and succeed, having parental support, positive relationships, good grades, anti-drug policies in school, and obviously community resources. So I think this is so important to mention. I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about kids, right, specifically. Because once again, this is something that's completely preventative. If it happens to you, inshallah, we'll give you enough resources for you to get out of it. But preventing it really is such a helpful thing. And as reading some of these preventative factors, it's so important for kids to have support. Because let's say your kid did grow up in a family of divorce. Let's say that you could not give your kid the best growing up that they could have. And now your kid's a teenager, and let's say they're butting heads with you, right? Because usually that's what teenagers do. They'll typically butt heads with you, which is normal. It's important for them to just have one adult, and that's it, just one adult. Even if it's not you, it's okay. They just need one adult in their life that they can trust and find support from. This could be an aunt. This could be a youth leader. This could be a person running a halaqah like I mentioned before. This is why we have Big Brother programs. It could be anybody, right? Because that kid needs to be able to build support and trust. Kids love meaningful relationships. They love beneficial relationships. Because if we don't provide that for them in the household, and we don't provide other healthy people, maybe in the family or maybe in our community, do you know where they turn? They turn to the internet, right? And they look for support and acceptance there. And you never know who you're getting there, right? And it's better for you to try your best with these things to really build that trust and support with your kid. Having this conversation about substance abuse, allowing them feel that it's okay to turn to you to talk to substance abuse about. Because once again, we don't want them going on TikTok and reading about substance abuse on TikTok where all the kids think it's cool and it's completely okay, right? So I'm going to kind of just jump into, and I have a question here that says, what are important qualities for me in a friendship, right? Ask yourself, what are some important qualities for me in a friendship? Because good friends can mean the world and really help us through very difficult times, right? So we're going to go briefly over just a couple of substances. Are we good on time? Yeah, okay. So, as we mentioned before, I'm just going to read a couple of the organs that alcohol, I'm going to start talking about with alcohol, because in my opinion, alcohol is one of the worst, probably is the worst substance that you can put in your body. So, there's issues with the heart, with the mouth, right, your liver, your gastrointestinal tract, your bones, your pancreas, your muscles, your lungs, and your brain. It contributes to immune dysfunction, right? And it contributes to 5 different types of cancers. 5 different types of cancers alcohol does. And the reason why alcohol is so dangerous is I can spend an hour talking about why alcohol is so harmful. It really, really genuinely is. So Oxford did a study just recently, I think it was within the past year, and they surveyed, I think it was 25,000 people, and they came to the conclusion that no amount of alcohol is healthy for you. No amount of alcohol, because I know a long time ago what we used to say in the 90s that a glass of wine was completely fine. No amount of alcohol is healthy for you, right? SubhanAllah, it really isn't. And then on top of that, right, talking about alcohol, it is in these communities, right, in workplace settings, in all these, whether it's in college or school, it's completely accepted. And I just wanted to kind of talk about that again. So because when we're preventing things like alcoholism, when we are preventing things like drinking, right, it's important to have these conversations because we might not think it's a big deal, right? Even though it's haram, right? Even though it's completely unhealthy for us, but people still fall into this issue. People still fall into this addiction, right? Because people make you feel like you're an outcast if you don't drink. Even if you say you don't want to drink, even if you say it's against your religion, people still push you. And where do we see this? We see this in Utah, right? Because it's also for Mormons, it is a sin for them to drink, but they're having huge addiction issues in Utah as well. So in my opinion, even though nicotine is technically the gateway drug as of 2022, over the 10 years of me doing intakes with clients. I usually ask them about their substance abuse history, and a lot of times the majority of people will say the first substance that they've ever tried was alcohol, because it is so easily acceptable. You can go to a restaurant and it's right there, and this is why, once again, it's so important to really be mindful of the environments that we're putting ourselves in, really be mindful of the friends that we have. And a lot of times these things are so insidious, especially with, I know in the world of finance, happy hours are such a big thing, right? In order to climb in your career, there's so much pressure that's put on us. So cannabis is the next thing I'm going to talk about. So a lot of times the misconception with marijuana is that there are no withdrawal problems, when in actuality there is, right? It's very common to feel irritability after that, trouble sleeping, decreased appetite, and feeling increased anxiety. So we do see it on the rise with children, especially vaping, right? Vaping is definitely harmful, obviously, for so many reasons. I would say within the past 2 years, we're seeing a lot of kids come in due to excessive vaping of marijuana. They're having issues where they can't keep any food down, and they're very nauseous if they don't smoke pot at all. The other issue when it comes to marijuana, when talking about cannabis, is in the 70s, right? The THC, so there's two components of marijuana. You have CBD, which we see is very common in a lot of products, but this is not the component that gets you high. And then you have THC, right, which is the component that gets you high. So in the 70s, the concentration of marijuana, of THC in marijuana was 5 to 10%. The concentration of THC in marijuana today is 20 to 30%, right? So a lot of times we see people that are smoking marijuana, they do experience, if they have, I want to make sure I mention this properly, because this is a very important point. So as we were talking about genetics before, if you do have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia or any type of psychosis disorder, if you do smoke pot, a lot of times people do have psychotic breaks, and they're irreversible. So we're going to move on to heroin, which I think is important to briefly mention, because we are in Paterson, we are on the East Coast. So a little bit of background about heroin is, we have in this New Jersey and New York, we have the purest heroin in the country, right? So other parts of the country do not have issues with heroin the way that we do, because here it's pure white, and by the time it makes it to any other part in the country, it's black tar, right? It's completely altered, it's completely messed up. I'm not going to talk about meth, because other places in the country have issues with meth. People really don't use meth in New Jersey. It's very few and far between. We have more of a heroin epidemic, right? Heroin is a huge issue. And I just wanted to quickly talk about heroin in the sense of the huge misunderstanding with opiates, especially heroin, is that why do people overdose? People sometimes think that you overdose because you're going through heroin withdrawal, but that's not true, right? Heroin withdrawal is usually over 2 weeks, and it's like a really bad flu. You can't die from heroin withdrawal. Overdose happens if I'm taking too much of a substance and it overburdens my system, right? So this is how heroin is very, 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 very dangerous drug. Right now it's being cut with fentanyl, which is also on the rise. And something else I wanted to mention about heroin, it's more aggressive in the sense of, unlike alcohol and marijuana, it might take a while to build up, in the sense of people that usually start drinking or start smoking pot, it might be a couple of years after they start noticing really intense effects, whereas heroin, your life will go down the hole in 3 to 6 months. So people, and there's usually a saying in recovery, you never see any old heroin addicts, because a lot of them pass. So the next is prescription pain medication, which is opiates, right? So this is very popular, again, amongst teens. They're very expensive to buy, so what usually happens with people that abuse prescription pain medication, you're spending $30 for a pill. It's cheaper to end up doing heroin, so what ends up happening is people usually start using prescription pain medication, and then it leads them to heroin. So same thing, you can experience withdrawal symptoms that are very similar to heroin. The next substance I wanted to mention is Xanax and Klonopin, which are very important to mention, because there's actually only 2 substances that you can die from withdrawal symptoms of. which are alcohol and benzos. So if you're ever using alcohol or benzos, please go to your nearest hospital and detox properly off of them, because you can die of a seizure, and it's genuinely horrific. Any other substance, you won't pass away. So always go to a hospital if you want to stop taking Klonopin or Xanax. So people usually don't prescribe Xanax anymore. They do if, let's say, if you get into a really bad car accident or if you have very intense anxiety, and they usually prescribe you a very low dosage, right, to prevent panic attacks from happening. So the issue with Xanax is it's extremely addictive, has a very short half-life, right, so you feel like you're constantly need to increase the amount that you take, and a lot like alcohol, right, even though Xanax is a pill, you go through periods of your life where it's completely blacked out, right? So usually when you see people coming in for help with Xanax abuse, they usually have gaps in their memory of years that they can't remember. And I actually feel really bad for them when they come in for help, because their anxiety is now through the roof and they're unable to deal with your anxiety, and you have to just tell them you just gotta wait it out. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about Adderall, which is, once again, it's kind of on the rise. There's a lot of issues when it comes to Adderall. Taking too much Adderall can, once again, lead to seizures, which is something which is not beneficial in any way. And we see this a lot with, once again, people, young adults. We see this with kids in high school. We see this with kids in college. We see this in kids in professions, right? Because we have these crazy unrealistic expectations that people feel like they need to abide on. The bar is super high. It's very common for other people to get prescribed Adderall. I believe in the state of New Jersey, we have a limit of how much you can be prescribed in the state of New Jersey. I believe at places like Arizona, there really isn't too much of a limit. So what are some issues with long-term uses of Adderall is, before we get to long-term issues of Adderall, you can deal with a lot of psychosis, you can deal with a lot of anger and a lot of paranoia. It is typically the equivalent of doing speed. So that's what we have for today. So I wanted to take a couple minutes to answer some questions. So I'm going to take a couple minutes. So the question says, can we talk about hookah, e-cigarettes, vaping cigarettes as substances used to cope with problems? So substance like this, right? So I'm going to just kind of throw it in the category of nicotine, right? So nicotine is the most addictive substance there is. It's not mind and mood altering, it's just mood altering. But the issue is with the habit that it also brings. So nicotine is completely unhelpful for you, right? For so many reasons. It's not healthy. People are turning away from cigarettes, but people are vaping more. The dangers associated with vaping is you're smoking more often, and in my personal opinion, I personally think vaping's worse than smoking cigarettes, which is not a very popular opinion. But the reason why I think so, right, is because quitting vaping is a lot harder than quitting cigarettes. Because smoking cigarettes, you can't light up in a mall. There's certain you can't light up in there's so many it's harder for you to smoke a cigarette in a situation than it is to vape. Vaping almost becomes like this pacifying behavior where you're constantly pulling, and it's more difficult to break that habit, right, of constantly smoking. And then also asking yourself, right, why do I feel better after I smoke these substances? Why do I feel better after hookah? Why do I feel better after e-vaping or doing any of these? Even if, like, people will ask, hey, if there's no nicotine in the vape, right, and it's just fruit flavor, can I smoke it? Don't smoke it. You're creating a habit. And a lot of times people that smoke substances such as, let's say a vape with fruity flavor, right, you're slowly, before you know it, you're going to add nicotine to it. And it's kind of also, right, what is the behavior of us if we're smoking hookah, smoking an e-cigarette, smoking a cigarette, vaping? What is it? We're taking deep breaths, which is used for in meditation, right? Because if you think about it, you're taking a deep breath to soothe and pacify yourself in the moment when we're feeling anxious, when we feel like we have a problem. But kind of really, a big thing that I like to think about is how, in what way, so if something's causing me anxiety, and something's causing me depression, and something's causing me stress in my life, how do I get to the root of that issue? That's usually my first answer, right? Or usually when I talk to clients. What is triggering that stress, right? What is triggering that anxiety? And how do I work on that issue with healthy, productive things that help me? We're going back to exercise, right? We're talking about how healthy exercise is for us. Smoking is an unhealthy coping skill. And what can I do to replace it with something better? So that's what I personally think when it comes to smoking and nicotine, whether there's with nicotine or there's no nicotine, it's highly addictive. It's a very difficult something. And nothing ever good ever comes out of it. Smoking contributes to so many different types of cancer. You know, there's a doctor, he's a psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Daniel Amen, I think his name. It's A-M-E-N. And he's a psychiatrist. And what he does is he does brain scans for people, right, before diagnosing them, before giving them medication. He's a New York Times bestseller. And he always gives the idea, which I think is such a beautiful way when it comes to any substances, right? Even caffeine and sugar. He says, why am I going to put a substance in my body that's going to deteriorate my brain? Why am I going to put a substance in my body that doesn't love me back, right? Does vaping and hookah and e-cigarettes, does this stuff help me love me back? It doesn't love me back, right? It doesn't help us. It's not healing my brain. It's not contributing to me feeling better. So, does anybody else have any other questions before we break regarding substances or substance abuse? We're good, inshallah. All right, thank you, everybody. I wanted to say I appreciate everybody that took the time out today. I understand we didn't have a PowerPoint, so thank you for everybody for sitting through this lecture and really listening to it and absorbing all this information. I appreciate everybody, and Jazakallah khair. Of course.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Serina, for coming tonight and sharing with us your expertise on the topic of substance abuse. We thank you for joining us tonight, and we really want to bring this topic to attention. And if there's any support that we can give you as a masjid, we are here. Contact the number on the screen, and we are available. Jazakallah khair, Serina, again, for sharing with us this information. Jazakallah khair.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح الفلاح. الله أكبر الله